Webinar today on No Minister, Why Digital Voices Now Need a Say in Policymaking. I'm Siobhan Benita, I'm a former UK civil servant, and I'm delighted to be chairing this webinar on behalf of Global Government Forum, publishing house which serves civil servants all around the world, and in partnership with Foundry for becoming very soon TPX Impact. Now, in terms of today's topic, traditional models of policymaking and policy development involve usually dedicated teams in Whitehall working on a particular issue, often removed from colleagues responsible for delivery of the final policy. And whilst that model has been under scrutiny for some time, new digital technologies are highlighting more than ever before the benefits that can be achieved with greater collaboration and new approaches. Civil servants are starting to share data in ways that provide helpful insights about their own operations, as well as about user expectations and needs. Where good progress is being made, they are beginning to bring together multidisciplinary teams of technical specialists and topical experts, and to build effective digital services that are centered around users' requirements and expectations. But this type of transformation requires civil servants to develop new skills and new processes, and for departments to build new capabilities in digital and data, to look at their governance structures, and to think about how ministers communicate differently with the public. We've got a really expert panel with us today, and we're going to be discussing all of those issues and a lot more. And in a moment, I will introduce our panel. But this webinar is also an opportunity for you, our audience, to put your questions to this panel. So whichever device you're on, you should see at the bottom of your screens a Q&A function. Please, at any point from now on throughout this webinar, use that Q&A function to message in your questions, and we'll get through as many of those as we can before the end of today's event. And now for our fantastic panel. So first we will hear from Natalie Taylor, who is Chief Growth Officer at Foundry 4. Natalie has 15 years experience of digital transformation. She wrote the business case for NHS.UK and worked on its delivery from 2007 to 2013. And after that, she joined the London Mayor's Office, where she revolutionised london.gov.uk, working across London's councils to support the adoption of London Government Digital Service Standard and delivering London Elects 2016. In her and many, many more. It's great to have Natalie with us today, and she's also going to be joined by two colleagues, Gavin Bell and James Herbert, who are on the call, and they may also join the conversation at some points throughout the webinar. We're then going to hear from Alex Whitehead, who is Service Owner at the Department for Levelling Up, Houses and Communities. Alex worked in policy roles in government departments before getting bitten by the digital transformation bug and joining the Government Digital Service. She's a real advocate for user-centered policy, drawing on parallels from her background as a historian, studying how objects and events are experienced by people. So as an example, working with the Parole Board, Alice designed a new process for victims to submit evidence to parole hearings, which minimised trauma and difficulty for victims. So it's great to have Alice with that perspective joining us today. And then last but by no means least, we'll hear from James Reeve, who is Head of Digital at the Department for Education. James builds and supports teams that tackle some of the Department for Education's most urgent, complex and challenging digital projects. These teams support service owners across DFE by doing exemplary digital delivery, fostering an inclusive culture and bringing digital skills to new areas. He's responsible for professional capability, the department's digital strategy, and how the organisation is set up for success. So I'm sure you'll agree we have a great panel with us today. As I said, please do message in your questions at any point. And without further ado, I'm going to invite Natalie to give us her opening remarks. Over to you, Natalie.
Hello, everyone. Lovely to see you all here on the webinar today, and many thanks, Siobhan, for that introduction. So hi, I'm Natalie Taylor. You've obviously heard who I am already, so I don't need to tell you again. I'm just going to talk to you briefly about some of my experiences with bringing together policy and delivery. And I thought that rather kind of talking about it at a sort of strategic level, I would just jump right in and give you 3 examples of different scenarios that I've seen in my career where there has been a disjoint between the two, and how it's been overcome. So the first one is quite early on in my digital career when I was working on nhs.uk, and I was responsible for the roadmap for the whole of nhs.uk and horizon scanning and strategy. And so one of the things I would do is I would regularly go and speak to policy leads across the whole department. And bear in mind, at the time, there was no NHSX, there was no NHS Digital, there was no Public Health England. Everything came under the Department for Health banner. Sorry, it's my dog in the background. We are live. So I would go and speak to policy leads to understand what their policy objectives were and what was coming down the pipeline. And that was so great because I was actually being proactively going to them and saying, you've got this incredible new digital resource, this huge army of digital people who've developed this platform that can actually help you to deliver your policy. So it was partly kind of educating them about the potential of digital technology to help them with policy delivery. And then it was kind of co-design, because they would explain to me what they had to deliver, and we would start coming up with ideas. And it was great because we were getting involved, therefore, in those conversations really early on, so we could help shape the solution together and help shape the budget together, and actually use this new resource. So I feel like that was quite cutting edge, actually, because we're talking about kind of, I was there from 2007 to 2013. So, you know, and it worked really well and was really successful. And that's from a sort of departmental perspective, I suppose. Moving on more to a supplier perspective, my second example was when I had a regulator as a client. And when I arrived there were 4 digital teams that had been set up to deliver 4 separate services. And there was also a policy team and an operations team who were kind of doing the more offline end of it, if you like. And the 2 of them were barely speaking to each other. And it wasn't, nothing had been done that was wrong. There was no kind of reason for any hostility. It was just simply a case of a total lack of understanding. So for example, the user researchers in the digital team needed to talk to the frontline staff to make sure they were building the right thing. And the operations team were like, wow, that's really high risk. Why would we let those digital people come and talk to our frontline staff? You know, that's crazy. And so it's just in this scenario, my approach was really to coach both teams a lot about the ways of working of each, and just try to bring them together in workshops to problem solve together as much as possible. And then also not just working at the team level, working at the leadership level as well, because similarly kind of digital leaders had been brought in, but there was this massive disconnect between the two, and helping them to understand each other better. So it really was just about education and coaching and patience. And it wasn't an easy resolution, but it did, over time, it really did start to work a lot better, and good services, end-to-end services that worked across the spectrum of the two were actually able to be delivered. And then the third example is a really recent one, actually. It was an EU exit piece of work for the Cabinet Office. And it was a kind of classic, number 10 want this thing really urgently. They want to be able to gather data from across all of the government departments. And they need it to be displayed in a beautiful dashboard that they can cut the data in lots of different ways and understand what's going on. So just make that happen, please. And of course, we then had the policy team within the Cabinet Office. And what I did was I put a really senior delivery manager and a really senior user researcher on that project. The delivery manager had actually had a permanent job at number 10 before. And the user researcher was used to working with very senior stakeholders across government. And so what they were able to do was that they felt really empowered, and they were able to challenge and ask questions. And what was brilliant about this project was from the off, it was set up as one team. So we had the Cabinet Office team, we had the supplier team, and we had the special advisors meeting regularly to decide what was happening and prioritise work. And that's quite rare, I think, in my experience. But it worked really well, because when this diktat was coming on, we want to deliver this thing, departments will just have to do it. We had a user researcher who said, well, why will departments do it? Can they do it? Should they do it? Are they going to play ball? And of course, you have the kind of centre saying, well, they'll just have to. And the user researcher was saying, well, I'm not sure that they're going to. And actually my initial conversations were suggesting that they might not. And they made the case for doing this user research. And, you know, there was a bit of tussle to start with, but because they were empowered and they were experienced, they were able to say, no, Minister, sorry, the facetious reason why this webinar has that title is because actually sometimes you have to be empowered to push back against what's coming from the top in a constructive and helpful way and educate those people in terms of how digital delivery is done well. And actually, do you know what happened was that we ended up with special advisors attending user research sessions and seeing the feedback from themselves. And of course, it completely changed their perspective on what they were asking for, and naturally it led to a much better solution that worked for both parties. So just to conclude, 3 very tangible and tactical examples I just wanted to bring to the table to hopefully kind of spark some ideas and some thoughts for the audience. You know, reaching out, being proactive and actually engaging with policy to find out what's coming down the track and working with them right from the start. Coaching teams where it's not working terribly well and just sharing and educating, and then also making sure that from the beginning we have one team who are working together with digital practitioners who are empowered to challenge and push back for the more senior kind of policy stakeholders. So that's my introduction, and I'll hand back to you. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Natalie. That's a brilliant way to set the scene. Those 3 examples really helpful and interesting to hear from you there, how in so many of those cases you seem to be kind of playing the role of that bridge between kind of 2 parts of the civil service and bringing them together and kind of being the translation almost in the middle of those 2, which in some departments might still be quite separate elements of the process. And really interesting what you say there at the end, and we'll get a feel from the audience, we might be able to do that in a moment, about the extent to which they feel like their elements are coming together, but also are they empowered to be able to say what is and isn't possible when it comes to delivering some of these digital products for senior officials and ministers. So thank you so much for setting the scene. Alice, over to you.
Hello everyone. I'm going to give a few remarks, and I warn you that they will be a little bit more theoretical in nature than Natalie's very concrete examples. I'm the service owner for the funding service in the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, which is a service that will exist to give out local growth funding to local authorities or other applicants. And this concept of a bridge that's come up so soon really resonates with me, because I don't know if anyone's familiar with the job title of service owner, but it's one that the government digital professions have adopted to really suggest somebody who takes ownership of the digital development elements of a service and is responsible for the sort of adequate and compliant delivery of those digital pieces, but is really located in a policy or an operational team, and therefore acts as an owner and a translator of what's happening with the service into the context that the team was operating in, perhaps before the service came along. So really identifying with that. I'm going to say a little bit about my background. I see myself as a digital professional, but also a user-centered policy design practitioner, and that may be something we come on to more as we go along. So that means designing policy and doing that in a way that places emphasis on the lived experience of the policy, whether that's by the people who it's for, the citizens or users as we call them, and the staff who live the experience of delivering it. And that user-centered design piece was born in the world of digital and GDS early days. In government, I should say. But I do have a policy background, and I started my career in the civil service on the policy part of the fast stream, not the digital part of the fast stream. I went to the government digital service on a rotation, and I was really inspired by what I saw there and their commitment to make things work for real people, because the reason that I joined the civil service is that I want to make things that work for real people too. So I've worked in both digital and policy, but it's really important for me to say that I don't see digital as a topic or a policy area or an industry. Digital is an industrial technology. It's a vehicle or a channel for things to happen inside. So it's not going to be separate for very long. And I really see it as coming together and stopping to exist on its own and just becoming part of all the things that government does anyway. I think it's also important to mention this element of services, which for me is the third part of the triangle between digital and policy. I revisited James's very excellent blog series in preparation for this, and I thought he summed it up really well with the phrase, services are an expression of policy. For me, digital services and policy are inseparable. And I've seen much more of a conversation around that in the last 2 or 3 years than in the 4 or 5 before that. So there's a few things that I thought I might mention so that perhaps we can pick up on them later in the discussion. The first is around raised expectations. And I think Natalie's already given us an example of where expectations can be very high. So I don't know if people are familiar with the Tom Loosemore definition of digital, but it's very well regarded in digital circles for explaining that what we're doing with digital is responding to the raised expectations of the digital era that we're now living in. And I completely agree. I think both citizens and ministers now have very much raised expectations in terms of access to services, in terms of brilliant design that delights people, and in terms of data. And I think where we start seeing more higher expectations of more asks of civil servants, that's when we know we're going to have to do something differently. How are we going to do that? I think we're going to have more digital literacy in government, and I expect we'll talk about that more. But how are we going to get to having more digital literacy in government? I think that an interesting part of this conversation is the opportunities that people need to learn. And my career was one that accidentally led me towards digital. And I think there's a lot to be done to think about how to bring digital to all the existing professions of the civil service, as well as creating the specialist profession, and how to build it in without making it, by calling it out, making it a separate channel or a side avenue or an optional tick box. So perhaps we'll touch on that more. And I think that perhaps today will feel like there are lots of challenges to bringing this agenda forward, but I wanted to end on a positive note. And I think to me, it really feels like everything is pulling in the same direction. Ministers are going there, citizens want to go there, the civil service reform programme has set out how it wants to go there. And so for me, it's absolutely not whether policy making is going to be changed by digital, but just how exactly it will be. And I'm really excited to talk about that today.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Alice. Alice, a great way to build on what Natalie said. Really interesting to hear that you started your career as a generalist kind of policy official in the civil service and have moved into digital. I think that will be interesting for quite a lot of the people in the audience. And it certainly raises those questions that you posed there at the end about if the civil service is going to meet these expectations from the public, from ministers, of what can be achieved with digital. What does that mean in terms of careers for civil servants? And what does that mean in terms of opportunities that they have to learn and maybe understand a bit better kind of digital and how they can use that in their own careers? And then I really love what you say about actually gradually it's all becoming one thing. Digital in future won't be a separate entity in the civil service. It will just be part of that policy, service delivery, service outcome that we all work towards. Thank you so much, Alice. A very optimistic note to end on there. James, are you going to be similarly upbeat in your presentation? Over to you.
Thank you. Well, yes, I hope so. And hello to everybody from lovely Westminster. I come to you today from the DfE buildings. And I'm going to talk, it's a really nice follow-on actually from what we've heard before. So some examples of how we've taken that approach in the Department for Education and how we've started to get there. You know, we've not gone all the way yet, but we've made a start. So I wanted to kind of share, first of all, a view from base camp, if you like, so where we were a couple of years ago and what we did to kind of really get started, and then talk about some things we've done more recently in the department, which have allowed us to kind of scale up and move out of the kind of startup phase and into the real operational phase where we can start to do this at scale and do it across a really big organization and a really big sector. And then I'm going to ask a challenging question at the end and turn the question on its head for you a little bit. But wherever you go, you're the leaders of the change in your organization, and where you need to go is up to you. So I'm not going to tell you where you need to go today. I'm going to cover how to set up the conditions for success in your organization so that you can take your organization on the journey that it needs to go on. And so first, that view from base camp. Look, first of all, take heart. The future is here, but it's just not evenly distributed yet. So no organization is perfect. This organization isn't perfect. GDS isn't perfect. Ministry of Justice isn't perfect. Wherever you hear about there's great practice going on, they're not perfect. They're making progress, but it's not evenly distributed. And your organization is just part of that beautiful patchwork of life. So there are always people who are going to be working on making change happen. Find people, call in the cavalry. So one of the things we did very early was we called in people from the outside who could come and show us what good looked like. They could come and tell us the examples. They could give us case studies of the benefit. They could give us their own business cases. And now we're in a position where we can do that too. So I've gone and talked to departments. I've gone and talked to people and say, look, this is what we've done recently. This is how we've involved policymakers in creating digital services and vice versa. So find the people who can help. And then for you as an organization, you have to think about capability. Your long-term strategy, your plan is all about the people. Everything else is a flash in the pan. The people are forever. So start small, pick your service carefully, find a few people, hire judiciously, find people who have been there before. And remember that a service or a setup is only as long-lived as the people who are there to maintain it and keep it running. And if that goes away, then you've got a legacy in your hands. So this is something that you can't forget. You have to keep it going. And remember that change is hard work, sometimes some of the most thankless work in government. So find allies and like-minded people and use them to reassure you and re-energize you when things get tough. Secondly, things that we're doing recently in DFE. We've made some progress in some areas, and we need to make more progress in other areas. And without a doubt, the thing that we do again and again and again, which works, is show the work we've done, tell our stories of success, and you cannot over-communicate this stuff. There's no picture you can show too many times. There's no framework you can over-discuss. There's no story about how many millions of pounds that you've saved that you can't tell enough times. We've had success recently in a particular example of getting digital voices into making policy, where we had user researchers who went out and did research and designers who synthesized that into a big plan of how teachers were getting value from their career. And we found something which wasn't adding value to their career, and then we could go and say, this isn't something which is useful anymore. This is something that we can look at changing or evolving or getting rid of because it's not good for us and it's not good for our users. And take things like that, have case studies, have them ready to go, have engagement sessions with senior leaders in the organization, and keep telling those stories and keep them understanding. And it really is, it's repetition, which is the key here. Tell the stories so that then they can tell them when they want to use them, and when they tell your stories, you know that you've made some progress. And then operationalize, think about your long-term plan, because there's a good chance your organization won't be ready for you. And so how are you going to make your organization effective? If you think that you're going to have to hire 50 user researchers to get to the scale you want to get to, well, how are you going to recruit them? How are you going to make sure they're good? How are you going to retain them? These are all questions which will hit you within a year once you start hiring. You need to be thinking about the long term as well as the short term. You need to make sure you're being businesslike and prioritizing, as well as being fleet of foot and agile and concentrating on the smallest problem, the first problem, the most important problem. And again, find those people externally, internally, wherever, that can help you do that plan at scale. And when you're planning, realize that sometimes there's evolution and sometimes there's revolution, and there's a time for both of them. And when you're revolving, make sure that you set yourself up to evolve out of that. And when you're evolving, don't close off opportunities to revolve, position yourself to revolve. And that's how you can get those leaps forward. And finally, to turn your question on its head, I agree. we need digital voices in policy making, but it's a two-way street, and we need policy voices in digital making too. Policy allies are so important for making sure that we build these bridges, as Alice described them. Find people in policy and make them look good. You have the evidence to make these people look good. Equip them in their meetings with ministers, in the meetings with their senior teams. Build those relationships, build the bridges before you need them. And if you're a digital team, don't get cocky. Don't think you've got the secret sauce to making great policy or doing user-centered policy design. Everything's a collaboration and everything's been done before. Much of what we do in digital is just a rehashing of the old policy cycle of yore with a few added extras. Digital teams often know how to implement it in a way that is fit for the internet era. But policy teams do it too. And don't be a victim of someone saying, oh, we knew that already, because that's a really disheartening thing for a digital team. So there are loads of allies out there just waiting for you to tap them up. So a final thought just on the last frontier here, which is we might be getting digital voices into policy making. Let's hope we can get policy voices into digital making too. But we should never forget operational staff and people on the front line, because they actually know what happens. They have the deepest insight and they know what works. And I think the next frontier is how do we get operational voices into policy making and digital making? And bringing those three things together will really set us up for success in the next 10 years.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, James. So it was a positive, upbeat note to finish our opening presentations on. I really like what you said, giving kind of some practical experience to people who maybe think they're at base camp, maybe their organizations haven't done so much on this. The focus, as you said, on people, getting the right people in and making sure you consult with the right people as well. And really nice to hear that story from DFE about really consulting with frontline people on the front line of policy delivery and getting those insights then back into leaders in Whitehall, how important that is. And finally, I love what you say about digital in policy as well as policy in digital, and that this is very much a partnership and has to be a two-way street. Thank you so much, all of you, for those opening presentations. That really has set the scene well. To the audience, great to see questions coming in already. Please keep those coming in. Before we go into our discussion, building on those presentations, I'm actually going to, I think, pick up on this sense. You've all mentioned in your presentations examples of where things are going well, maybe things aren't going quite so well, where that bridge has been built, or maybe where there's still a bit of a divide. So I'm curious, we're going to try something that I will admit I've not tried in a live webinar. So we've had dogs. We are now going to try a live poll on this webinar. So to the audience, I'm going to pose a question for you, and you should see a poll come up on your screens. The question I would like to put to the audience is, to what extent is digital expertise embraced and deployed in policy development and delivery in your organization? So you've got three options there. You can just click on one of those. Your first option is, we're doing really well with lots of progress being made. We're still on a journey with this is the second option. And the third option, which might be a bit, as James was referring to, base camp, this is still a huge challenge for us. Could you take a couple of seconds, look at those options, and just complete that? And we will bring those results up in a moment straight away. I think we can get the results of those straight away. If this technology, here we go, we'll see if digital works, if this technology works for us today. So a couple more seconds, and then we will have a look at the results. So if you could answer that now. Alexa, in a couple of seconds, are you able to bring up the results of that poll straight away? Here we go. Interesting. So a spread there. We have got 14% of the audience saying we're doing really well with lots of progress being made. We've got half of the audience saying we're still on a journey with this. And then we've got 36% of the audience saying this is still a huge challenge for us. Now, bear in mind, our audience today is a overwhelmingly UK civil service audience. Thank you so much, Alexis. We've got 14%, 50% and 36% there. So in light of that, I'm just going to come back to the panel very quickly to ask, do those results surprise you in any way, or is that what you would have expected? And in light of those results, so essentially it's given a mixed picture, I think, with half saying they're somewhere in the middle on that journey. So in light of that context, how difficult do you think it's going to be for the civil service to get where it needs to be on this journey? And I mean, at the moment, given that we maybe don't have the skills and the capability internally within the civil service, and people will be looking to organisations like Foundry 4 to help with their external expertise, how difficult do you think this journey is going to be, this transformation is going to be, and how hard is it maybe to bring those people who speak different languages together? I'm going to start with you, maybe, Alice, because you're very focused on the people side of this. How difficult, one, were those results surprising? And secondly, how difficult do you think it's going to be to get that up to kind of 100% of people thinking that they're doing well in this?
Well, am I surprised? To be honest, I would have been unsurprised to see a worse result. So I think I'm going to say that I am pleasantly surprised to see that distribution of people feeling that they're along the way already on that. I suppose one of the things that comes to mind is that the civil service is a intensely hierarchical organisation with a quite unique governance structure, if you will, with ministers setting direction for the workforce. And although it's interesting to think about how civil service careers can change, I think there's probably a cap on what will change until those changes start kind of creeping into the top discussions. Now, I am not in those discussions, but I'm really pleased to hear examples like Natalie gave at the end of her remarks, because that gives me that hope that those discussions are starting to happen in those forums, which are really so important in establishing the direction that people sort of pull towards or focus on. So there's a lot to do in terms of helping civil servants absorb those skills and feel comfortable working with the expertise that maybe we're not ever going to be able to have permanently in the civil service and that we purchased from the market. But there's also a kind of different question around the ministers and how civil servants can have a small role to play in educating ministers and giving them the examples that show that there's a sort of right way and a less right way to go about doing these things. And so although we may find that happens at a pace that can't be controlled, it's fantastic to see that there's already such a feeling that it's going in the right direction.
Thanks, Alice. James, do you feel similarly to Alice? Did these results surprise you, and how hard do you think it's going to be for departments to complete this kind of transformation process?
So I think similar kind of answer. I was, pleasantly surprised that so many people are on the journey, but it does also just go to show that half of us feel like we're sitting at the base of the mountain, looking up, thinking, how are we ever gonna even start this ascent? I think though that they shouldn't feel disheartened, because we're all constantly sliding down the mountain, to extend the analogy, right? The pace of technological change is increasing, and we'll fall further and further behind if we aren't all kind of trying to keep up. So in terms of how difficult will it be, I think it's going to be difficult because the problem that we see today is different from the problem that we'll face tomorrow, and we need to keep adapting, keep being humble, keep saying, I don't know, and why, because that's how we'll answer the question of, well, so what next? You know, in the example of education, there are so many opportunities from technology that we haven't even begun to explore yet. You know, as soon as we learn a little bit more about what could help in, you know, in whatever settings technology gets used, there will be even more technology which is available that we can't even dream of.
Yeah, so it's an evolutionary process. It's constantly changing. Natalie, I mean, you've worked with so many public sector kind of organisations and government departments in particular. So did that poll reflect where you think departments are? And also, I'm interested in your thoughts on coming in as an external kind of advisor to government departments. How difficult is that to get maybe policymakers to understand even the language of kind of delivery and digital when you first come in? And is there a resistance to that kind of help?
So I was pleasantly surprised by the results, but then I wonder if that's sort of, there's an element of self-selection for the people that are on this webinar, because they're people that are already interested in this agenda. So it may be that if we did a poll with the whole of the public sector, that it might be slightly lower numbers. I don't want to be a pessimist, but you know, kind of suspect that's the case. I think, yeah, coming in as an external advisor to government, it comes down to me a lot with kind of leadership and education around technology, and a sort of deep understanding. It doesn't have to be a deep understanding, but just enough of an understanding of technology and what goes into doing it well at the top and the senior levels is quite important, and is often quite lacking. So you know, and then that's quite difficult to influence. So I think sometimes actually, and this goes for all types of shapes and sizes of organizations, you've quite often got people in kind of lower ranks who get it, who are trying to make the case to seniors, but because you have this kind of systemic hierarchy, bringing in external consultants can actually sometimes help, because they'll listen to external people sometimes more than internal people, which is wrong, but it's often true. So I think sometimes it gives you weirdly a bit more clout. And I remember when I went to work at City Hall, trying to I'd come from GDS, and I was trying to explain the digital service standard and agile working and all these new practices, and the importance of technology, not just being an IT department in the basement, and the pushback I was getting. And you know, quite a few of my peers were saying, you know, they probably won't listen to you, you'll probably have to bring in an external company to help you make this case, which is quite frustrating, I think. But you know, so I think also it just comes down to education. You know, I feel like it's no matter what your remit is as a leader, whether you're a chief financial officer of an organization or a minister, or no matter what your remit is, I think everybody has a responsibility these days to have a sort of minimum level of education around technology, because it's an intrinsic part of how we work and how we do business and how our staff operate and how people run their lives. And unless you kind of have that, then I don't think you can really be an effective leader.
Yeah, really interesting. Well, we've already got questions coming in from the audience, and they build on what you've all just said there. So the first one that came in was from Giulio Folino. I apologise if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, but they've asked, what is your ideal team makeup for bringing teams together? If a team is working in an agile way, how would you bring policy people on board with that? So, for example, they said, Natalie, you mentioned you had SPADs attending research sessions. Would you bring them into demos, show and tells, etc.? So I think it's your thoughts on kind of what the ideal way to do this is, and the ideal kind of mix of people that you would like in a room. And maybe just for some generalist policymakers, I don't know even if the term agile, you know, an agile way of work is a familiar term, so it might be worth just a little bit of unpicking of that. James, is this something that you've got experience of?
Yeah, happily. I think it's a bit like I said at the start of my remarks, it's a little bit different in every organisation. But there are probably some things which are apply to everybody. So I think the first is you just have to expose them. You can't teach people this stuff. People have to experience it to get bitten by the bug, I think is what Alice said. You can tell people and they can have an awareness level of understanding, but that probably just allows them to let you pass on by. Whereas for someone to actually become an advocate and to become someone who's going to help you, you need to expose them to it. So I think you do need them to be in the team. You need them to have shared goals, shared outcomes, shared experiences, because ultimately those shared experiences are culture, right? Those are the things which people fall back on and rely on and say, oh, I know and I trust that person because we had that shared experience and XYZ happened. That is what builds up trust between people. So you've got to get people into those experiences. Yeah. That's not to say that teaching people some of the things isn't important too. And, you know, digital and data and technology is a profession. It's a recognized framework inside government. It's a skilled occupation. It requires, you know, significant training and investment in upskilling yourself. So we shouldn't devalue that, right? The language we use around agile, the language that developers use, the language that we use in Scrum teams is important because it helps us to be effective at doing our jobs. Where it becomes a hindrance is where we need to drop it. So we need to be very careful about the language we use, but we need to also be aware that language is a valuable tool that we shouldn't let go of. Yeah. Finding a good way to help people learn without feeling threatened is probably the right way through. And I think this is often about compromise because it is a two-way street, and you'll need to find some things which they want to do, which you need to help them with, and vice versa. And I'm an example of that today. I'm wearing a suit and a tie, and I'm sitting in a Westminster office. And this is not my preferred outfit, but I'm wearing it today because if I meet someone and have to talk about a specific bit of policy, and they're wearing the same clothes, they can identify with me, and we can build a stronger bond than if we didn't. And it's a small sacrifice for me to make. And on other days, I'm wearing jeans and a t-shirt. So it's all about adapting and using all the tools you have available to build relationships and think about that in everything you do, because everything is about people.
Thanks, James. Natalie, I think this question came after your presentation. So your thoughts as well on what's the ideal makeup of that team? And you did mention SPADs. That's quite interesting, actually, to have the advisors in the room as well when these are being done. So what's your sense of what makes kind of an optimum team when it comes to these kind of techniques?
I think, obviously it's going to depend on the situation. So I wouldn't list off all the roles in the multidisciplinary team, but I think, so when you get into that Scrum team mode, quite often you're already in delivery mode. And actually the engagement between policy and digital probably needs to have happened before that's even started. So, you know, at discovery or before discovery. And I think the other thing is it's the roles that you have who are taking the decisions about sort of which stories you're prioritizing and which features you're going to build and what the MVP is and what the roadmap is for the product. So that might be, depending on the language you use in your organization, it might be the product owner or the product manager, or it might be the service owner at the kind of more senior strategic end. And I think so that role is really important, because sometimes I've seen it where you've got a product manager who's like the digital manager of the team, and then you've got a product owner who's the kind of more on the policy side, and they partner together or not, depending on how well it's working. But what's really important is that there's somebody at that level who is working with the team day to day, who understands the vision for the service, and has some ownership of that, and is therefore working with the team all the time to make sure that their work is going in the right direction to reach that policy objective, and at the same time is understanding what the team is exploring and exposing through their work, through user research and prototyping, etc. So, you know, this has to be somebody who holds the policy kind of keys and vision involved in the work from start to finish.
Great, thanks. Alice, you were nodding away there and seeming to be agreeing. And I mean, you've mentioned, I've written down here, you know, you talked about service owner as your title, and maybe policy people not even understanding that title and what that means. Then we've heard about Scrum teams, we've heard about agile techniques, all of these. So to what extent, having come from that kind of more generalist background yourself, your experience of what makes a good kind of multidisciplinary team in this respect, and is it an issue to an extent of language, of understanding, and do you recognise a lot of what Natalie and James have said there about what you need in building these teams?
I absolutely do recognise it, and I think that the language point is a really interesting one. James talks about hiring judiciously, and honestly, I feel that the sort of digital sector has quite a long way to go in terms of providing providing a wide pool of people who see beyond the boundaries of maybe what they're taught in design school, maybe what they're taught when they learn about programming. It's not my background, and perhaps I shouldn't comment, but there is I think a reasonably well understood defensiveness on the part of government officials to be told how to do, when they're told how to do their jobs by people who don't understand how government works, even sometimes in quite a basic way. And that sounds quite extreme, doesn't it? But I think it feels quite extreme if you've worked in government for a long time, to be being given advice by people who don't understand some of the more basic structures of government. So I think there's something, I'm always interested in bringing people on board who show a real interest in policy, or in what government does, or have even, sometimes got a politics A level that is going to be really helpful. So there's a thing there about asking people, we're asking civil servants to learn more, but we're also asking people who want to work in government digital to learn more about government. In terms of that service owner role, I think there's maybe the name isn't that helpful, but I feel that there is quite a lot of potential. And as I've talked about to people about my career, I see a big space for people who understand both of the things. And I don't know what we might call that. We might call it lots of different things across different departments. There is a real need for someone who can understand why both sides sort of act as they do, and in the absence of them really being one team and really coming together. And I know that in DfE there have been some more restructures that really try to bring those things together, and maybe James can tell us a bit more about those. But while we don't have a conception of delivery in service lines, for example, we may need to have people who are able to hold both perspectives in their head. So the sort of we're a policy team, and we're tasked with carrying out ministerial priorities on our policy. That's one perspective. And then also we're a service, we deliver for a user, and we need to our service needs to perform. And it's quite difficult sometimes to change people who are used to being in one perspective into the other. So another thing that I'd say is around the idea that policy is very fast moving, and my experience has been that if you don't stay engaged, you lose the thread, things move on, and it's really useful to have someone in the team who knows that they have to keep on going back, keep on checking in, try and build up those important relationships, maybe with private office or with Director General's offices, to follow the policy and understand what's happening with it. And it's not just important in terms of perhaps the service delivery or the build or the timelines. It's also important for that narrative about what you're doing, because you could be thinking that you were responding to priorities, and you can be sort of going around talking about what you're delivering, using those priorities as your linchpin, and things can have completely moved on. And buzzwords and sort of tags that we use for things are very important in advertising the success and the value for money that digital is bringing to government. So those things really need to be aligned. I could say a little bit more about teams, or you may want to move on.
We'll come back to that because there is another question in a minute that you can pick that up on as well. But so you've done quite a passionate kind of plea there for people to understand how government works and the world of policy making. I just want to pick up on something that one of the Foundry 4 colleagues has asked about, which is interested in how maybe politicians and maybe general policymakers, maybe who don't understand technology and digital currently so much, might reduce everything to its most simplistic level. So might think, for example, the solution to everything in their policy area is to produce an app. Let's have an app and that will make everything work well, and don't really understand just how much could be done by using technology, data more, efficiently, AI, robotic, all of those things that could be deployed in that policy area. Natalie, I'm curious, you mentioned that kind of pushback to ministers when they ask for something that maybe isn't realistic, but also, do you think they just simplify everything when it comes to digital? And it's James's point, is there a two-way maybe lack of understanding of how these two worlds work and how they can come together to maximum benefit?
Yeah, and it brings me back actually to something Alice was saying, which is also about there is a discrepancy, and I suppose it's a bit of an elephant in the room here. On the one hand, we're people delivering digital services for the citizen, which is a long-term investment that we need to do, and on the other hand, we're serving ministers who are interested in building and showing off shiny things to demonstrate their success. Now, you'd hope that those two things were the same. They should be the same. But I guess that's not always the case. And I think, so sometimes, like, I just want an app and it's got to do this and it's got to do it in 2 months' time so I can launch it on breakfast television, come hell or high water, and you're going to make it happen. Versus, well, actually, maybe there's a better way of doing this. It's going to take a bit longer, but you'll get something. It is the kind of, it's the clash of worlds, isn't it, really? And I suppose it's how those of us kind of stuck in between the two navigate the two and find out where we can where is good to compromise, because there's always compromise, where there's opportunities to educate on both sides of the fence, and where there's opportunities to come together. And I think it's an art, I think, that you learn over many years of working in this space, is when you challenge and you push back and you say, no, Minister. We never say that. No one would have a job if anyone said that. But you get the point. When do we push back and challenge, and when we don't, and kind of working out when is the right time to do that is kind of really important.
Yeah, thanks, Nathy. I mean, James, this point about maybe people not understanding how much digital can help in terms of delivery and what the potential benefits are. This goes back to your thing about you want digital in policy as well as policy in digital, isn't it? And you've given some examples of how maybe you help build that mutual understanding, but is that your experience as well, that there's a long way to go still in policymakers really understanding what digital technology can bring?
Of course, and I think that any organization is set up with incentive structures, and it rewards people who can say yes to things, and so it rewards the kind of things that we see. But simplicity is attractive, and that has some upsides too. But we have to remember that policymakers are come under pressure to solutionize. They come under pressure to give answers, not problems. And so if they hear about something out there which is a technology solution or might be a great new option, then they can be really compelled to go for it. And then if by some accident as well it gets out that that's something which you're going for, then it can be difficult to wind back on that, and you can get stuck down a track. So I guess there are two things. There are making sure that everyone is involved early on in coming up with understanding of problems and of solutions, but also, well, of course, as Natalie says, being prepared to say, yes, Minister, sometimes you just have to do something. But I think in the middle ground, there's that, between the just do it and the really, really strategic, there's how you push back. And the stuff that's worked really well for us is providing that evidence and telling stories. So probably the most difficult mind to change was when we wanted to start doing the first bit of real digital by default delivery in the organization. And to get that energy and that momentum started, we got a video of a user using an existing service and failing repeatedly. It was painful to watch, failing repeatedly when they were using a service, and just to use something as simple like a search function, and that generated that feeling of, oh, this isn't good enough. We've got to do better here. And I'll finish up with a Maya Angelou quote, which is, well, a slightly truncated one, which is, it's not about, people don't remember how you made them think, they remember how you made them feel. So you don't need to give someone an exact answer about how it needs to be, but you need to leave them with a feeling of that something's got to change and that you're the people that can help them with that.
Brilliant, thanks, James. Alice, I am going to come back to the issue of teams, but on this issue of kind of helping policymakers to understand digital more, you mentioned that the key for you was doing a rotation when you were a fast streamer, and that got you into the kind of digital side of things. Would you like to see more opportunities like that for civil servants, where they get to experience maybe sitting with a digital team, or do you think that's not a sustainable way going forward?
I actually think that's a brilliant idea, because when we are policy people in their jobs are subject to multiple pressures. So, and it's even when we've worked very successfully with policy teams to deliver, we've always been conscious that that's not the only thing they're doing, and that it's probably about a quarter of the work they're doing that they do with us. And I think it would be really more effective for policy people to learn if they could have that pressure. I don't just mean in terms of their time, in terms of their accountability, if they could have a rotation or a secondment where they actually could just learn. And so we tend to work with people when they're essentially under pressure to deliver or to do something with a reduced budget, and they feel that pressure. And I think doing something just a bit more relaxed could allow them to really lean into those feelings that James is describing, which I absolutely agree with, and which was the way that I, sort of had this change of mind in GDS, because I also watched videos and went to user research sessions and felt embarrassed, frankly, as a representative of the government that provided these services and wanted to do something better. And I think people would be able to embrace that more if they weren't also worrying at the same time about the timeline and the scalability. To pick up on James's point sort of about leaders and trying to worrying about simplification, for me, something that's really important about that is setting the agenda, digitally speaking. If ministers are setting the agenda, what is the digital team doing? I think that there should be plenty of things to talk about, to produce ideas, and to, it's okay to have shiny things, to pick some things that are really good to do and explain why they are shiny, and what they're going to give you. And then to tie into this point about feelings and sort of empathy, I think in order to be able to do those sort of pitches and to say, look, this is the thing we want to concentrate on, can we do it? You do need a bit of cover and a bit of independence in your resourcing and your setup, so that you can put multidisciplinary teams onto things to do a bit of preliminary work. I mean, if you do preliminary work like research, you can then put together a very effective pitch that points people towards the things that your sort of longer term, more technically minded strategic focus is telling you are the right things to do.
Great, thanks, Alice. I'm going to come then back to a question from the audience. So Oliver Cook, so he's sent in two questions, but I think they're related and they pick up on that issue of teams. So he said, what are the actual barriers then to having digital and design approaches embedded within policy teams and policy making? So the biggest barriers that you think of, and how do we then move from what we have now, from generalist to multidisciplinary teams? So I think some of you have touched on this, but he's saying, real time, real terms, how can we overcome these barriers? And that might pick up on some of the issues that I think Foundry 4 are mentioning around maybe annual reporting cycles. don't actually, they're not conducive to people thinking long term about a different approach. You know, they get reported on every year, maybe for immediate outcomes, rather than looking at that long term or data led approach. Natalie, I'm going to come to your thoughts. What are the biggest barriers then to getting these kind of teams up and running?
I think you've asked the wrong person, actually. I'm not sure that I'm the right one to answer that one. But I'm interested to see, so we've got Gavin Bell from Foundry 4, who's on the call as well. And I know that he did a really good piece of work with one of our clients last year, where they brought together the policy and the digital teams really effectively. So I just wondered, Gavin, if you could just quickly give us an overview about how that worked, because I think that might help to answer the question.
So this was a project for Bays, and the key it was a grant issuing program, and the key thing at the center of it was the voucher design. How do we design essentially a payload so that people could say, I qualify for that? So there's an eligibility thing which drew on previous schemes that they or their property had been part of, their own eligibility in terms of who they were, and then the measures that they could get a voucher for. And we ran probably over about 6 weeks, a series of workshops with policy and data analytics people in Bays, with the various suppliers, to workshop it so that we teased apart what the policy was, what the grant was expected to do, and worked out, was that implementable? Was it capable of change? What happens if someone changed their mind? And so we essentially rebuilt the policy in digital pieces rather than in words, and we tested it to make sure that it was possible, viable, and realistic, and so that it could be operationalized and run for the long term over the course of that grant.
Brilliant, thank you, Gavin. And how did you find? Were people happy to come together? Like, was there any resistance to bringing different people together in the same room?
There was a lot of pace in that grant scheme. It really needed to get out the doors. Often a lot of government things are. So getting attention from the delivery teams and the policy teams and the kind of data analytics teams at the same time, so that we could have a coherent conversation that joined together those various different bits of that department, and then get the suppliers to adopt that, because what we defined changed slightly how it operated, so that it became, as we took it from kind of words on a piece of paper into digital elements, it needed to change slightly so that it could become capable of change, so that people changed their minds or came back again to reapply for the grant, that it worked correctly.
Thanks, Gavin. So very quickly on Oliver's question, to add on to what Gavin has said, just Alice and James, if you had to say kind of what are one of the two biggest barriers still to getting multidisciplinary teams up and running, what would you say they were? I'm conscious we are running out of time quite quickly.
Okay.
James, sorry, James.
Oh, sorry. Well, look, it for me is communication and structures in the organisation which inhibit that. Because people fall into their organisational silos, and it's a tragedy. So I think the answer is something like what Alice described, which is where service ownership brings together accountability for policy, for delivery, which includes digital delivery, and for operations inside one unit. So you have one team with shared goals, and then they can work together. You know, break down the organizational structures into units which deliver value for users, and so form up teams around outcomes, and then make a single person accountable for the whole outcome, and, you know, setting the policy agenda, delivering the thing, and then running it for the long term. Don't have a functional split where you drag those bits off into different bits of the organization.
Thanks, James. Alice, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, so I would add that a really big barrier is confidence in policy teams, and where we can take some actions to support people. We've seen really good results, and we've particularly seen that around hiring, but also procurement. So there's one part is just to say, we're here, we're your friends, we're a support team, this is what we do. And our digital director at DLUC has really made that part of its ethos. And where we've been able to encourage people to kind of take the first step, but also move some of the structures that people often think are really set in stone but aren't. So for example, line management, we've seen real take up of the things that we're offering. So one of the things that we have adopted is matrix management in the DDAT. So within the professions managing each other, but that's across headcount units in the civil service, not just across teams. And maybe people think that's not possible. You can't be line managed by someone not in your sort of headcount group. But I can't speak for everyone, but in ours it actually is. So where we can put those things in place, we'll say, we've got your back on this. You know, we know you've never done it before, but we're going to help you. And if it's not a success, we'll still be there and we'll make it a success, or we'll turn it around, or we'll do it differently. And I think I just want to say to Oliver that we have seen, things that I didn't think were very likely to happen. It is starting to happen. I've got, I'm in a policy team. I've got 13 people, DDAT people who work with me, and our other 40 colleagues in the division are all policy and ops people. And I've also seen parts of my department who are started to think more about being user-centered, not really to do with digital, but just being user-centered, hiring their own user researchers, and not even really seeing them as DDAT professionals, just seeing them as a team member with specialist skills. And I think that as we just merge kind of gradually over time, it will chip away at it being a massive novelty.
Great, thanks, Alice. I am, as I say, very conscious of the time. We're going to do one final round of summing up in a moment. Just before that, to the audience, just to say, you should have received in your inbox a questionnaire in the last couple of minutes. Please do take a couple of minutes after this to fill in that questionnaire, because it just means that we can make sure we give you the webinars that are most useful to you. So I'm very grateful in advance if you are able to do that. So in the time that we've got left, I'm going to come to James and then Alice, and then finally to Natalie. But just looking ahead, you've all been quite optimistic. And our poll showed that we're kind of halfway there in terms of people who think they're already on this journey. What would you say the future looks like in terms of transformation for the way policy is developed in the civil service? James, I'm going to come to you just for a couple of minutes on this.
The future of transformation, it's a big question, and I don't want to do too much crystal ball gazing here. I don't think it's going to change away from being about people, but I do think that certainly in organisations where we're starting at base camp, we need to think about all the things that change people. And I think that too often the departments, but not just departments, organisations in general, think more about structures of organisations than they think about the living, breathing people within it. So I think transformation starts in the heart, and when the heart is on board, then you can move to the head and help people to learn and grow. And then I think when you are happy that people are in the right mental place, then you can think about structures. But anything else is going to lead to pain. And we're at a pivotal point where if we change things or transform things and it causes pain, people are gonna resist, and they're gonna close off. And actually, we need them to open up. And because digital is about openness and transparency and working in the open, exposing ourselves to challenge and being willing to fail, we need people to want to feel open and vulnerable and able to expose themselves to try new things. And so we have, this is a change where you can't compromise on that principle of hearts, heads, and then structure.
Brilliant. I love that. I love the way that's put. Thanks, James. Alice, your thoughts on the future?
Yeah, I mean, I really agree with what James is saying. I suppose my way of seeing this in time is that it's a one-way street, and it's probably been a very slow start compared to kind of ultimately what that gradient on the graph is going to look like. And we really felt in our department that coronavirus really accelerated the rate of change in a kind of a sort of behavioural way, because people were working remotely, and also because people wanted to access services remotely, and kind of finally, because the emotion and the vulnerability of the situation accentuated the sort of user-centered narratives potential. And I think that the rate of change is going to pick up. I hope it isn't going to plateau. And I suppose I see my job, and when I go to my job every day, I think about how to make a really small change, make one more person familiar with a concept, or change one person's mind, or put up a note to a private office that's going to contain a little bit more than we put in last time. And so that job of translating, but not just translating, also conveying and communicating new ideas, I like to imagine that familiarity is going to spread. Like it already is spreading. It's spread through the cabinet secretary's words to civil servants. It's spread through Michael Gove's sort of ideas about how the civil service can change and be better.
Yeah.
We do need to keep it sort of realistic and feasible, and not be all about the exciting tech and forget to invest in the people and the other things. But I think that there's something there about, ultimately we're going to look back on the time when everybody wanted an app for everything. We're going to look back on the silly things that people said because they didn't understand how technology works, and that time is going to be in the past. And I'm sort of looking forward to, it might take a while, but ultimately the ideas are going to spread, and the best practice that the pioneers in this field, because that's what the leaders of this moment are, because they don't have any models to go off, their ideas are going to be accepted as the best practice ways of getting things done that you can just copy.
Great, thanks, Alice. Natalie, I'm coming to you. You opened the webinar. I'm coming to you to finish the webinar. Your thoughts on the future, but also maybe just reflections on the conversation as a whole.
Sure. Okay, thanks. So I think just in terms of the future, I feel like we've had a big focus on the sort of front end citizen facing world for the last few years, which is obviously incredibly important, but it has to be built on the right technology at the back end. And that really hasn't had enough focus. So I think we're going to see a lot more focus on data, on security, and on really getting rid of some of that legacy technology so that we can join up these services more coherently and do more for hopefully kind of less money for the public purse in the future. I think that's a big challenge that we're still yet to overcome. And I think we're out of necessity going to have to see a lot more of that in the future. And I think in order to be successful at that, we're going to have technology, deep technology expertise at the table a lot more, and in senior roles, in senior discussions, to explain the implications of decisions being taken, because the technology is the platform on which we run our organizations, and it's incredibly important, much more so than it's ever been. So just to wrap up, so some of the points that I noted down that really resonated today, which I think are kind of my takeaways, are it's actually a very positive story. We're moving in the right direction gradually, but we are already bringing the two together, and we've heard examples of that happening in practice. And I think I'm certainly seeing it happen more and more, and it sounds like others are as well. Ways that we can all do that is to find allies, learn from others, both policy from digital and digital from policy, share the work that we're doing openly so that more people can learn from it and it can be shared. We do have an amazing digital government community actually who are really good at sharing. So the more of that happens, the more we spread the word, and the more we spread the best practice. Engaging with senior stakeholders and building those bridges before you need them, I thought was a really good piece of advice shared earlier on. You can't teach people this stuff. I think those were James's words. You need to, and Alice's words, you need to get bitten by the bug by doing it. So opportunities for policy colleagues to do rotations and secondments into teams to help them to learn is really important. But then on the other side of that coin as well is the importance of having digital colleagues who understand how policy works and how politics work. So they're not just coming in with this very kind of blinkered view of the world and how things need to be done, and are actually, you know, giving some slack to the policy colleagues and their ways of working, and having some respect and some understanding of that, so that the two can work more coherently together, is going to be really important. The key barriers are, I think, as James said, seem to be structures and communication, but this solution of having the sort of service ownership, which has been a concept that's been around for quite a few years now, really since the GDS exemplar time, but actually really making that work, so that we're bringing those multidisciplinary teams together right from the outset to co-design solutions together, is going to be, it's going to definitely be a helpful way forward. Yeah, so I think those were the key points for me. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today, and thank you so much to our speakers. There's a link on the screen now to Foundry 4's Transforming Government report, which touches on some of the areas that we've explored today. So do have a look at that if you'd like to read more. And you can see my contact details are there as well if you'd like to talk to us further about any of the themes you've heard today.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Natalie. From GGF's point of view, it's been an absolutely brilliant webinar. Thank you so much for all of the information. It's been so informative, and I think the audience will have found it incredibly helpful. To any member of the audience, if you're interested in pursuing some of these issues, GGF Global Government Forum are actually running a training seminar on Tuesday, the 23rd of November, on the subject of applied leadership in the digital world, and details of that will be in your email, in your inbox. So if you want to look in more detail at that, places are limited. Please do look at that quickly and secure yourself a place. There will be a link of this webinar sent to you with the video. You can watch it all again, or you can share it with your colleagues. And also we will be producing an article with some of the key points from the discussion that will also be sent round to you in a week or so's time. So it just leaves me to say a huge thank you to Alice, to James for giving us so much of their time, and to Natalie and her colleagues from Foundry 4. Thank you so much for being the co-host of this event today. I think it's been wonderful. Thank you to the audience for all of your questions, and I wish everybody an enjoyable evening and hope to see you on another webinar very soon. Thank you and goodbye, everybody. Goodbye.